here is a summary of the final season of You. What if we gave the TikTok girlies who idolize Joe Goldberg an intervention? They are trying to be meta. The last obsession for Joe is you. Wow. Groundbreaking. As an idea, it is not necessarily bad. This is the final season, and therefore it is rather thematically fitting for the last season to be the most heavy on being a mirror for us rather than a window into the demented psyche of Joe. And it would be poignant if the execution just wasn't so stupid. Yet, I only could wish to say that this wasn't expected, or that the show was pristine up until this point. It wasn't, and it is exactly the flaws that plagued previous seasons that still exist here and result in exactly the messy, frustrating finale of You. To understand why that is the case, you can look no further than a character that is supposed to be representing of us, the audience. This season sees the introduction of Bronte, a character that is first shown to break into Mooney's that now belongs to Joe. Then she ends up working in the bookstore, then Joe does his thing where he seduces the woman, and then it is revealed that actually, Bronte was just straight up lying to Joe to try and get to him. It is revealed that she was out to get him for the crimes that he has done in the past. And at this point, the show does an admittedly interesting thing. Bronte ends up at the police station and is handed an opportunity to turn Joe in, which was her goal all along. But she chooses instead to not do that, because apparently she's seeing Joe in a different light and her convictions about him are wavering. As frustrating as it is, I think that the essence of Bronte is an interesting one. If you want to extend the metaphor of Bronte being the audience, it kind of represents how from the outside, when you have plain facts laid out in front of you, you can for sure say for certain that Joe is evil. But if you actually meet a person, the person becomes real. The show points out as much. And listen, as much as I understand that it is easy to hate Bronte for going back to Joe after her jig was exposed, it is important to understand that when it comes to real connections, they are not just as simple as plain facts. And that is what I think the show is intending to show. I think that it is one of the very brief moments of brilliance in the season. Because yes, we as an audience hate Bronte for this, and there is enough evidence to suggest that this is what we are supposed to feel towards her. But it displays just how much Joe can be alluring and manipulate things in his own favor. This entire thing is also just kind of a metaphor for how we as the audience can be manipulated by Joe, since we are so close and intimate to him. And honestly, while I initially hated her character, as the episodes went on, I just felt sad for her. One of the standout scenes that involves her is the scene she shares with Marianne. Marianne basically sits down with her and tells Bronte this.
Men like Joe, they really catch you off guard, don't they? Even when you think you have all the facts. Even when you think your hard-fought instincts are so good. You're not stupid. And as long as you are alive, it's not too late.
And dare I say it, it is a very beautiful scene. I think it also is just an interesting insight into how we approach victims in situations like this. Because for Bronte, it was easy to dismiss a lot of what Joe did because it wasn't as tangible. Marianne sort of brings it into perspective for Bronte in that sense, since Bronte gets to hear directly from a victim of Joe. I overall like that the sentiment that they are going with here is not really one of judgment per se. They are putting in the work to show that it is not necessarily your fault that you could fall for a guy like Joe. You could be aware and still be susceptible to that. I think it was nice to show that people like Joe can get even the best of us, but the show isn't really demeaning about it, and chooses compassion and empathy. And there are other parts of her that I also liked. The way she asked Joe to remove himself from Beck's book was symbolic in basically reclaiming the narrative away from Joe. It is also a stroke of genius to have Bronte Louise exploit Joe's weaknesses and basically craft this persona that would be the perfect victim for Joe. And all of that is genuinely great. I love the idea of Bronte and ideas surrounding her character. But here's the thing. Now that the show is done, I think we can have a more mature conversation about the way that the show is written. And here is a hard to swallow pill for you. Sometimes You has all the subtlety of a brick. There, I said it. The show sometimes does have moments of subtlety, and when it does, it is great. But when it doesn't, it comes off as incredibly stupid, which borders on arrogance. Sometimes it wants to think of itself as more intellectual and deep than it actually is. And all because the show just cannot hold itself back from being so damn obvious about certain things. The show just becomes annoying sometimes because it tries to prove to you a point really hard, but in the most aggravating way possible. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because season 5, while being somewhat of a step up from the last season, still seemingly has the same approach at its heart. The two seasons have strong ideas driving these seasons, but these seasons cannot help themselves from being so smug about how they present themselves. If you recall, season 4 was very big on being a mystery, and it was very confident in being a mystery, that it kept trying to be all cutesy and meta by directly pointing out various tropes of a mystery. Well, the gist of that situation is that they executed the mystery so poorly in the end that all of those mentions just came off as stupid. What they did there was that they wrapped Joe's personality slip into a mystery. They were trying really hard to prove a point about how Joe is running away from his crimes, but is ultimately incapable of doing so. Again, the idea is good, but the execution is so overly on the nose and dumb. It sounds way better on paper than it is in execution. Same thing can be said about season 5. With Bronte, they are clearly targeting the audience, but they are targeting a very specific subset of the audience, the TikTok girlies who glorify Joe. They are targeting the chronically online Gen Zers, I guess. Now, I feel like this word was never warranted before for the show, but it sure is now. Fanfiction. This season reads as an awful fanfiction. So when we get to the reveal as to how Bronte is fake and how and why this whole catfish situation, the TV show tells you that it was the Redditors. The Redditors did it. Bronte is just a Redditor that began connecting the dots. Then we get to find out that it is a whole group of the Gen Z activists who are trying to take Joe down. One of them is the son of Dr. Nikki, and Bronte was actually a friend of Beck's. While I appreciate more Beck and the show trying to bring everything full circle, I hate when the shows do this. Suddenly, a random character that never existed before pops up and has relations to someone all along, and they become relevant, and then the show tries to convince you that they are relevant. This is even more problematic when you consider that there exists an entire trail of people that Joe has hurt in the past, people to whom he has done way more damage, but somehow Bronte, a person who is not even relevant to anything until she herself makes herself relevant, gets to take up this role of taking down Joe. Then things just get progressively dumber, because then the show is like, oh my god, what should we put in? Quick, we need some slang from TikTok. Deluxu, baddie, Fortnite, Menti B, Boomer saying simp. Quick, we need to make the love interest a manic pixie dream girl. Thank the fucking heavens that at least they didn't make her a goth GF. And then they also make Joe discover Wattpad level smut. I swear, you cannot make this stuff up. Listen, as someone who is Gen Z, this just comes off as extremely stupid to me. Honest to God, it was unbearable sometimes to get through this nonsense, because the show takes the whole Gen Z TikTok girly angle and proceeds to beat you over the head with it over and over and over. It was quirky and fun exactly 0 times. It rarely, if ever, works when a show does this. Then we also get the friends of Bronte go to true crime podcasts. What? I swear this whole Gen Z angle is so awful, as if the thing that this TV show needed was to bring in Redditors and true crime. Again, just like in season 4, this season goes to extreme lengths to try and prove that they are smart by writing this character and to make this grand point about their own audience, and they do that in the most unsubtle way possible. There is meta, and then there is just being stupid. And this is even before we get to the fact that neither Joe nor Bronte make any frigging sense. So the thing about Bronte is that she is supposed to be this big gotcha character, right? First to the audience, then to Joe. Neither of those things work as much as the show would like for it to work. So let's break it down by covering the former first. So the thing that the show keeps emphasizing in the relationship between Joe and Bronte is their age gap. First through the lingo that Bronte keeps using, but also through Joe himself repeatedly saying that she is his younger employee. Joe also keeps pointing out how she is full of the joy of youth. At a first glance, it would make some sense, but then you get to the reveal that she was Beck's friend, right? So what the hell is this talk about her being younger? The show tells you that she's actually 27. Does it make her Gen Z? Honestly, I don't even think so. The show's chronology is whack, but I think they are now ahead of us since they had a time jump. Wait. If they're ahead, does that not mean that the Gen Z characters potentially could be 27? Never mind, I'm an idiot. But when you realize that she's in a similar age range as Beck, Bronte just comes off as way more juvenile, and her writing just doesn't even make much sense. Maybe she's not Gen Z, maybe she's millennial, and like maybe these two generations do share TikTok culture or whatever. But the funny part about this is that we had Gen Z characters before in the show. Delilah, sister Ellie, Paco, Nadia, they were Gen Z characters, and they were written way better and managed to get through a sentence without making it sound obnoxious. And also, it is just weird all along, since the show somehow wants to make you think that Joe is going for someone as young as Nadia from the way they behave, but on the same age range as Beck. Yeah, it doesn't really make much sense, but Joe doesn't either. And this brings us to the latter, that Bronte is a big gotcha for Joe. Now, the thing that really trips me up is the time jump that they have. I believe the time jump is 3 years, something like that. And apparently during these 3 years, Joe has been completely normal. He didn't do anything bad. This is, I believe, the first time that a show has a substantial time jump, and it kind of doesn't exactly square with the whole character of Joe. You see, I thought that the show was trying really hard to convince you that here is Joe. He moves around. He tries to live a normal life over and over again, but he always fails because he just cannot help himself. It was his pattern. Then season 4 does a little funny thing and strays away from that and makes Joe develop a whole nother personality. In my original video, The Downfall of You, where I discussed season 4, I was going to include like 10 minutes of me rambling about how this season doesn't fit within the whole patterns thing they got going on. I cut that in the end, but here's the gist. It doesn't really exactly make sense because Reese Montrose was not some woman for Joe to fix. It doesn't fit anything that we have seen of him. I suppose it was born out of his need to be justified and maybe a bit redeemed. But what is important here is the conclusion that the show takes away from this arc. Joe essentially has his inhibitions completely removed. The show used to have little stops for Joe, little things such as moral conundrums or whatever. Joe was shown now as a full-blown villain. Season 4 finale was explosive in that sense, because now we had a woman who supposedly accepted him, helped him cover up his crimes, and he also got insane amounts of resources to do whatever he liked. Yes, he and Kate agreed to now do good, but that finale, if anything, showed just how warped Joe's idea of good was. So they want for us to assume that Joe somehow, after us seeing this downward spiral of 4 seasons, which culminated in him not shunning his dark side but rather embracing it, for him to have somehow managed to stay good for the entirety of 3 years? Am I the only one to whom this feels weird? I will be honest, this Joe just doesn't feel like the Joe I expected to see, because all of the previous information would suggest that his patterns would only be intensified rather than subdued, which also makes Joe so extremely stupid. You know, there was another very specific thing that bothered me about this season. There were uncharacteristically high amounts of things that were hidden from us. The thing that really put Joe on the radar, not just on the Netflix catalog but also on the entire pop culture map, is the fact that he used to literally stalk his victims. He would put on his little hat and go off on his little adventures to try and find as much info as possible about his victims. This season though, he doesn't really do that as much. He conveniently doesn't go investigate Bronte, you know, his signature move. Well, he doesn't do that to her. Part of this is probably because he isn't really treating her as a you right from the get-go, which doesn't really make sense in the context of season 4's finale either way, but okay. And while there are brief moments where he does investigate something surrounding her, the plot conveniently sidesteps anything that could bring him closer to the truth. And of course we cannot do that, because that would risk revealing the obligatory mid-season twist. And you may say that being with Kate changed him and that having a child made him different. I would beg to differ, because we already saw this type of scenario with Joe. He was with Love Quinn and had a kid, yet it took him 5 minutes into moving into a new house for him to find the new you, and only an episode to manage to find out all he could and steal some underwear. You're telling me that this man would suddenly cease to do that after he became so powerful that he could kill someone without persecution? It just does not make sense for Joe to be like this. You may say that he got too arrogant and therefore felt too safe or too cocky. Sure, but he should have gotten too arrogant and too cocky in his methods, and not in the lack thereof. If arrogance is really the angle that the show wants to go for, make him lazy in how he carries out his previous patterns so that the laziness and the cockiness catches up to him, not just cut out the defining characteristics of the way Joe has always operated, which is why the overall attempt at a gotcha with Bronte being the stalker just doesn't work as well as it should. You cannot help but feel like they had to nerf Joe for him to even be susceptible to such trickery by Bronte. They literally had to neuter him and his patterns of stalking for Bronte's charade to hold up. What also doesn't make sense is how Joe subsequently just gets back together with Bronte. One episode he was cussing her out and saying that she ruined his life and that there would be consequences for it. And you would think that he would then just murder her, because he literally needed less of a reason to do his previous murders, so why should he let her live? But it apparently takes only one cutesy text for him to get together with her. So what really gets me about both Joe and Bronte is that their connection is contrived in both directions. The show is just so adamant in proving a very specific point that it sort of lets it blind the narrative. The exact same thing that happened in season 4 as well. So what the hell is even the point? Now, what if I told you that there is yet another parallel to be established between seasons 4 and 5? You see, I think that there is some amount of good reasoning behind the show being so blatant and obvious this time. When you realize that this is the final season, you cannot really fault the show in trying to put the end to all of the fawning over Joe Goldberg. I think it is clear that they wanted to end the show by very clearly spelling it out for the audience that Joe is indeed awful, and they did that in all the fonts and their sizes all across the walls this time. I think it is ultimately not a bad decision, as much as you may fault the show for its sloppy execution of Bronte and and what she represents, she wasn't a completely baseless invention. There are people who actually idolize Joe and unironically root for him, but I don't think that they did that all that well. Since they very obviously spell it out for you, the ending message isn't really bad, but it could have been handled way better. So we see Joe ultimately end up in prison, which is a decent enough ending for the show. You would think that this is the justice that he deserves. The show even ends on this note.
Maybe we have a problem as a society. Maybe we should fix what's broken in us. Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's you.
Very edgy, very deep. I am still crying, shaking, and throwing up about it. Yeah, this kind of reminds me of season 4, where they also tried to say something about society, something to do with eating the rich. That season 2 was obvious in that messaging by creating a sorted Joe fodder of rich characters that had absolutely no depth whatsoever. That social commentary was as deep as a puddle. This social commentary is slightly deeper, yet there are at least a couple of ways in which the show still manages to undermine whatever they try to say with it. So let's talk about Kate. Kate as a character has done some pretty horrible things. She managed to give cancer to a ton of children, which is not as direct as the killings that Joe has done, but it is some pretty big crimes being committed here. Seasons 4 and 5 both show her being quite regretful over the whole thing, and that is all fine and dandy. Then her half-brother pops up, gives her a bunch of crap about how she is hesitating to turn Joe in just to save her own ass, which is entirely correct. Her guilt can come off as somewhat performative since she doesn't actually do something to directly address her crimes, and this is also considering the fact that she told Joe to kill Bob, and also just went ahead and imprisoned Nadia. And the way Kate failed Nadia cannot be overstated. While Joe might have lied his way through, he certainly couldn't have lied about who killed Reese, aka the crime that Nadia was framed for. So Kate knew full well that Nadia was innocent in the entire situation and helped Joe lock her up. And I am saying this as a fan of Kate. I was a fan of her ever since season 4. She was always a total diva to me. Charlotte Ritchie is perfect in this and no one will change my mind. But then she does decide to finally do something that manages to get Nadia out of prison and gather Nadia and Marianne together to confront Joe for what he had done to them, which is decent. It is a step in the right direction. Then there happens a situation where she dies in a burning building, except she does not, because then we see her get a happy ending with Henry. It also doesn't help that Kate and Joe literally ripped Henry away from Dante and his husband, who one would presume provided Henry with a nice and loving home life, devoid of serial killers as parents. I think they should have just let her die heroically, to be honest, because this ending just directly contradicts whatever message they try to play with Joe. While you can sympathize with Kate in a sense that she doesn't seem to be a completely awful person, or at least she tries to stay good and doesn't justify herself in the same way that Joe does, you still have to remember just how many lives Kate has helped to ruin or she herself ruined. The difference between Kate and Joe is only their approach, really. Joe isn't as apologetic as Kate, and also he does things way more brutally. That is really all there is to it. When it comes to their crimes, their actions are still self-serving at the end. Kate might be misguided, sure, but she is still culpable. Does she try to make everything better? Yes, and good for her. But giving Kate a happy ending is just not a good look. This type of ending kind of implies that because Kate gives off different vibes and looks slightly sad while doing bad things, she gets to live her life without facing jail time. This then implies that receiving punishment is about the person who did the crime, which is really not it. Apprehending a criminal isn't about the criminal. It is about the victims and the damage that they receive from the criminal's actions, which the show proceeds to ignore in the instance of Kate, and it is just another dagger into the messaging of the show. The whole quest that Bronte has at the end in trying to put an end to Joe is about Beck and every other victim, Kate included. Kate is not an innocent in this instance, but she is still a victim of Joe. She was manipulated by him just like other women were. But this is just an inherent contradiction that giving Kate a happily ever after creates, because the show focuses on her victimhood and her escape from the clutches of Joe, but then conveniently forgets about the very real damage that Kate has done. She may have done a lot of good things after that, but the people affected by her do not receive justice by her helping someone else, just not how that works. And this is just a bad look for the show. Then there is once again Bronte of the entire situation. I have seen people say that Bronte somehow hijacked the show and stole away spotlight from other victims by having the show being focused on her, which, well, yes and no. I disagree with the choice of having her be there at all, but that is on the writers and not on the character. But I also disagree that she steals the spotlight. She doesn't necessarily steal it, but the show should have added additional time to highlight Joe's other crimes. We already covered that Bronte just fell for Joe's charms and is just another victim of his. At least, that is what the show has tried to communicate to us. But there was a very easy solution to all of these concerns. Just have Joe sit in court and show some of the court proceedings. I kind of don't really get why we didn't get any of this in the first place, considering that it would have been the perfect opportunity to highlight the extent of Joe's damage. It is again one of the ironies hidden within the finale. Yeah, they want to focus on the victims of Joe, but they are kind of selective about it. Not gonna lie, it is kind of an awful decision that they prioritize the court of public opinion rather than the actual court of justice, because only one of those is actually capable of actually giving out justice. And guess which one they chose to focus on more and make a point about the audience? Did the TikToks help? At least a bit, I guess, but Kate wasn't actively on TikTok while imprisoning Joe as far as I know, neither was Bronte or Nadia or Marianne. I feel like the show had an opportunity to humanize the victims more and sort of give more of a voice to everyone, but chose not to use it, because we mostly view these victims through how Joe views them, which is a perspective that is warped. But imagine we did get a scene where Joe gets to face the damage that he has done, with all of his crimes systematically laid out in front of him, and I feel like that would have hit hell of a lot more than Joe just getting shot in his pee-pee and people making fun of him online. The one outstanding scene, as we discussed in this season, is Marianne talking to Bronte. It is kind of a testimony in a way of a real victim of Joe. So imagine having everyone coming together to share their testimonies about the damage that Joe has done. It would have been a great final note to end on, considering that the show has always made a very big show and dance of him trying to escape from his crimes. Would have been nice to see him unable to physically. So here are some final assorted thoughts. I appreciate the season for what it tries to do, but I don't feel like anything really works. The narrative, while having a nice foundation, is just ultimately messy. You cannot help but feel that they took some lazy routes along the way too, since Joe is not even consistent with his previous seasons. It apparently was better to warp his character to fit the plot rather than to allow the character to progress on its own course. The message, whatever they are, do not even really land as well as they could have. There are such easy fixes for some of that, and the show just doesn't use them, just to prove some higher point about TikTok and the fandom. Again, it is not to say that they don't have a point. If you look at any other serial killers, you can see how people glorify them, but it's just the way they execute everything is just very whack. It would be wrong to say that I am surprised that the show turned out to be this way, but I am certainly disappointed.